morning. It's August 15th, 2022, and this is Digging Deeper with me, Gabe LLanas. Today on the episode, we are going to be talking about worker productivity, tracking software, and how it opens the door for a new version of the labor movement. We'll be talking about digital church and the way a lot of the statistics that are gathered about the church basically just use it as a business. And we'll touch on political violence and how our opinion and history can shape how we view it. So, good morning to you guys. Thank you again for joining us. If you haven't been here before or you haven't done this yet, go ahead and hit subscribe and the notification bell so that you never miss an episode. We try to go live at 10 every Monday morning, Mountain Standard Time. Unfortunately, last week I had some technical snafus that made it untenable, but I'm back, second episode. Pretty excited for this one. Like I said at the end of the last episode, if you have any things that you would like for us to touch on, any subjects, or if you have any constructive criticism about production value, things you'd like to see in the show, that sort of thing, please let us know in the comments, or you can find us on any of our social medias. They're all over the place, but the easiest way to find them is to go to spitefilledclothing.com, where you can also get shirts and read our blog and find all sorts of resources on how to find help with homelessness, abortion, mental health issues, like all sorts of different things. So be sure to check out our website. We'd love to have you join us. We'd love to have you comment your opinion on anything. Like, we are open to the discussion. We want to have those conversations. I know that I can be a snarky bastard in the comments just like anybody else, but I am genuinely trying to talk to you guys, just like Dave is, just like Brandon is. In the long run, we all know that we need to work together, and the only way we're going to do that is through communication. So, with that said, let's get started with the show. Today we're going to start off with worker productivity tracking. An article came out in the New York Times yesterday about this. We're going to read from some of the article, and of course the link to the article will be in the show notes. So, in lower paying jobs, the monitoring is already ubiquitous, not just at Amazon, where the second-by-second measurements became notorious, but also Kroger cashiers, UPS drivers, and millions of others. 8 of the 10 largest private U.S. employers tracked the productivity metrics of individual workers, many in real time, according to an examination by the New York Times. Now, digital productivity monitoring is also spreading among white-collar jobs and roles that require graduate degrees. Many employees, whether working remotely or in person, are subject to tracking scores, idle buttons, or just quiet, constantly accumulating records. Pauses can lead to penalties, from lost pay to lost jobs. Some radiologists see scoreboards showing their inactivity time and how their productivity stacks up against their colleagues. At companies including JP Morgan, tracking how employees spend their days from making phone calls to composing emails has become routine practice. In Britain, Barclays Bank scrapped prodding messages to workers like "not enough time in the zone yesterday" after they caused an uproar. At United Health Group, low keyboard activity can affect compensation and set business or bonuses. Public servants are tracked too. In June, New York's Metropolitan Transportation Authority told engineers and other employees that they could work remotely one day a week if they agreed to full-time productivity monitoring. Architects, academic administrators, doctors, nursing home workers, and lawyers describe growing electronic surveillance over every minute of their workday. They echo complaints that employees in many lower-paid positions have voiced for years, that their jobs are relentless, that they don't have control, and in some cases that they don't even have enough time to use the bathroom. In interviews and in hundreds of written submissions to the Times, white-collar workers describe being tracked as demoralizing, humiliating, and toxic. Micromanagement is becoming standard, they said. But the most urgent complaint spanning industries and incomes is that the working world's new clocks are just wrong, inept at capturing offline activity, unreliable at assessing hard to quantify tasks, and prone to undermining the work itself. United Health social workers are marked idle for lack of keyboard activity while counseling patients in drug treatment facilities, according to a former supervisor. Grocery cashiers said the pressure to quickly scan items degraded customer service, making it harder to be patient with elderly shoppers who move slowly. Ms. Kramer, the executive, said she sometimes resorted to doing busy work that is mindless to accumulate clicks. We're in this era of measurement, but we don't know what we should be measuring, said Ryan Fuller, former vice president of workplace intelligence at Microsoft. So, having worked in both sides of kind of the labor market, like I've worked white collar jobs in ministry. Oh, sorry, my chair. In ministry and in insurance, and I also have worked an endless litany of blue collar jobs. I've worked in a dairy plant. I have worked in a farm. I have doing tractors and pulling heads and moving irrigation, that sort of thing. I have worked as a chef for the vast majority of my life. And I can tell you that in both situations, the excessive monitoring and micromanagement in that top-down sort of style is probably the biggest cause of workplace strife and also workplace demoralization. Nothing will crush your spirit more than you thinking you did a great job and worked your butt off all day than a boss telling you not enough time in the zone yesterday, guys. With the advent of this ability for employers to manage digitally, we find that there is this over-reliance on the simple thing. And I know we've all seen this in our jobs before, where management finds a tool that they think is going to be extremely effective at tracking, X aspect of your job. But because it's so simplified and it's so dumbed down, it misses a lot of the nuance of your job. And as a consequence, your boss is like, well, you didn't pump out X amount of applications today. We're just going to use that terminology. You didn't do 35 applications. Well, that's because you got to like 17 of them, and number 18 was overly complicated or had an issue with it that you had to troubleshoot or resolve. And because that one was more difficult than all the other ones, it broke the standard. So you didn't meet the average or the above average that they're constantly seeking. You and I and anyone else that has ever lived in the world, including your boss, knows that missing those nuances because of mistakes and human error and literally any kind of hiccup that can happen in your day is reality. Unfortunately, a lot of corporations don't trade in reality. They just trade in raw numbers. A business doesn't care if you did the job right, it just wants you to have it done. And a lot of that rests in the profit over people ethos that we see rampant in the current stage of capitalism that our country is in. We find when we're looking at all of these different things, the root of it is often in how do I dumb it down to make it easier for one person at the top to manage several people that are below me. That's where almost all these hang-ups come from. If you're trying to overwork one person into managing a larger group of people, of course they're going to find the simplest and often least efficient or most efficient solution that loses the actual reality of the working environment. You have X amount of trucks to load, you have X amount of widgets to produce, you have this that you need to get done. I remember very distinctly working at the dairy plant and having numbers that we had to make. And those numbers were based on the maximum amount of productivity that machines could run. So for us to make those numbers, we had to work like 10 hours a day at max capacity, no problems. Unfortunately, most of the machinery was from the 60s, 70s, and 80s and had a lot of issues, would break down daily, or had operator error issues where something didn't get set up quite right due to lack of training, or maybe even somebody that just wants to milk the clock. And as a consequence, you end up just being pushed back and back and back and back. And because we're not maintaining maximum efficiency with a machine that we have little to no control over other than running it, humans are punished because they're not doing their best job, even when they're clearly doing their best job. So when we take these like efficiency statistics that are based in like hypotheticals that make no room for error, then of course people are not only going to be demoralized because they're being blamed for something that's out of their control usually, they're also going to be punished financially by either cutting of hours, losing a job, not getting a pay raise, or they're going to get punished socially. What if your machine is the one that's always screwed up? I know the guy that was down line from me who had a really hard time with the packaging machine that that had to wrap. I was constantly speculating, is he just trying to pad his hours? Is he just doing this because he doesn't like me? Because we didn't have a very good relationship, socially. You know, does he just do this because he doesn't care? Is it screwed up because he wasn't paying attention? That kind of social dynamic, pitting worker against worker, is not necessarily what a corporation wants, but I think in a lot of ways these statistics create that situation. This kind of employee tracking and monitoring and do it this way all the time, no room for nuance, causes these kind of financial and social and business issues that most corporations are trying to avoid, but they're too busy going from the top down to hear anything from the bottom up. Let's go back to the article. Larger, more established companies are taking similar steps. United Health Group has 350,000 employees, a perch high in the Fortune 500, and annual revenues of hundreds of billions of dollars. It also has strict systems for measuring idle time that some employees say are deeply flawed. Jessica Horning, a Rhode Island social worker who supervised 24 other United Healthcare social workers and therapists seeing patients with drug addiction and other serious problems, said the laptops marked them idle when they ceased keyboard activity for more than a short while. They were labeled derelict during sensitive conversations with patients and visits to drug treatment facilities. This literally killed morale, Ms. Horning said. I found myself really struggling to explain to all my team members, master's level clinicians, why they were counting their keystrokes. In recent years, she said, the scores have become even more consequential. Our performance evaluations, social workers are rated 1 to 5 based on the amount of time they were digitally engaged, numbers that affected compensation. Ms. Horning said her team spent hours each week piecing together alternative records, but had trouble keeping up with compromising core parts of their job. So, right now what we're seeing is an evolution in effectively corporate and capitalist management of a new class of people. So, when you're creating something in a factory, when you are on your delivery route with, a distribution company, when you are, behind the line at a restaurant, slinging food into the window. If you've worked in a traditionally blue collar environment, you are 100% familiar with this kind of employee tracking, like dysphoria, for lack of a better term, where upper management is looking at what you're doing and blaming, the people doing the work for not meeting standards that have been arbitrarily set by software or by somebody who's literally never done the job. This is normal in the blue collar world. It's a big part of why most of the surviving unions are in like factory settings and production settings, is because they've been having to buck against this for quite some time. The new issue is that now there's a very effective way to track how much time somebody has spent electronically doing something. And because of the nature of white collar business transferring from like physical, like paperwork, into electronic and digital presence, you can see now that because we have the ability to track electronic movement, for lack of a better term, of an employee, we can now also track like what they are doing, right? Because you can look electronically at how much paperwork they've shuffled, whereas before you just had piles on your desk and you didn't necessarily have any accountability for exactly how much time you spent working on a specific thing as long as the jobs were getting done. This opens the door to a new form of organization within, specifically within this white collar sphere. Um, if you understand something about your job that your employer doesn't understand and you are being punished for their misunderstanding, that sentiment is going to run through your group very quickly, and it makes it significantly easier to step back and say, okay, these are the things that we need to actually have happen. These are the things and ways that those things can be measured, and this is the compensation that we deserve. The typical union organizational structure. Why does this open it up? Well, let's look at the history of the union for a little while. We're going to go way, way back from the transition from Revolutionary era into the Industrial Revolution. So we say at the beginning, this is taken from Wikipedia just for a basic history. By the beginning of the 19th century, after the American Revolution, little had changed. The career path for most artisans still involved apprenticeship under a master, followed by movement into independent production. However, over the course of the Industrial Revolution, this model rapidly changed, particularly in the major metropolitan areas. These conditions led to the first labor combination cases in America, where people were suing the government for the right to collectively bargain. Okay? And the reason that hadn't been an issue before is because there wasn't as much collective production. Okay? Before the Industrial Revolution, you had a master who taught an apprentice who went on to own his own business, or work as a journeyman under the master until the master retired. That's Hannah. I'm currently live. Please don't do that. Okay. Sorry about that. I'm going to try to catch that. This is all new and I do it at home, so yay me. Train of thought back on. Okay, so you start out with this apprentice master situation. So there is no real combined effort towards production other than in a small core group of people. Once the Industrial Revolution changes that and creates this mass body of people that are producing things, and one person that is the master telling them what and how to do it, as that group of people finds ways to become more efficient, to work faster, to find ways to make the job easier, they're then going to a master and saying, these are the changes that we need to make. We've all been there. You know more than somebody else. We all feel that way sometimes. Imagine a group of people coming to you and telling you, you're absolutely wrong. Everything you're doing is wrong. We need this. Or you're not paying us a fair amount of wage for the amount of money that you are making. Most people in general are going to balk against that just out of simple pride, right? And as a consequence, we find that the labor movement coalesces around the mass of people that are actually producing or creating items. And they're saying, these are the things that we need from you to continue doing our work effectively and to continue being satisfied with our job, right? You're at that same cusp point right now where a corporation is saying to people, we have done it right for X amount of time. We are coming from an old purview of, this is how this job gets done. It's how it's always gotten done. We're going to set these benchmarks, and as our equipment gets better, we're just going to increase those benchmarks based on equipment and technology. And the way we're going to measure you is by using that same equipment and technology. Unfortunately, that equipment and technology is not advanced enough to assess the true amount of work that people are doing a lot of the time. If you have worked from home, either during the pandemic or in general, you know that situations like my daughter walking in the door and me getting incredibly frustrated because I don't know what to do with that situation happens. And this segment that was supposed to be 10 minutes long is now however many minutes long because of like a little blip. Okay? Things change. Reality is happening around you. And as white collar workers are facing the same kind of micromanagement that blue collar workers have always faced or continue to face, they're realizing that something needs to be done because we are the mass of people that is actually doing the work for a corporation that's telling us not enough time in the zone, but we still have billions of dollars of profit. There is a disconnect. There is a place in the middle there where labor needs to step up and say, nope, that's not how this works. You don't get to tell me I'm doing a bad job when I'm not doing a bad job. As a therapist, you don't get to criticize me based on keystrokes when my job revolves around helping people in a one-on-one conversation. Like, how distracting, how awful would that be that you're talking to somebody trying to recover from drug addiction and the whole time you just have to type your notes? How is that conducive to anything? It's time to disconnect. Like, so take some time to think about it and understand that if you're facing these kind of situations, the people at your job are also facing these kinds of situations, and it's time to talk. It's an opportunity. It's an opportunity for anybody that's ever just wanted to have a better working environment. All right, so on to the next subject. We are going to talk a little bit about digital religion, and then we're also going to talk about the statistics that are gathered on churches, and in particular this one kind of like list that's been coming out every year for a few years, and just the way it feels to hear Christian leadership talk about Christian congregations. So, from the University of Waterloo, and again, all articles, I'll have some, what I'll do is I'll post a link to my show notes and then just, throw that on Google. Anyway, a new study from the University of Waterloo in Canada concluded that the growing trend of digital religion among U.S. and Canadian millennials mostly complements rather than substituting in-person participation in organized religion. The study, Digital Religion Among U.S. and Canadian Millennial Adults, was published in the Purview of Religious Research. Under University of Waterloo sociology professor Sarah Wilkins Laflamme, I hope I said that right, explored the idea that as digital forms of communication increased, that the religious community could opportunistically stem the tide of secularization in North America. She asked whether new spiritual and religious spaces for new segments of the population could be formed to welcome in those removed from more conventional forms of organized religion. The backdrop was more and more people looking for digital mediums for spirituality, such as chat groups, online sermons, and social media content with religious content. We found that while digital religion isn't necessarily attracting a lot of new millennials to participate, it is making the experience of those already involved richer. Wilkins Laflamme said in a statement, as other scholars eyed the adoption of digital religion and its role in spirituality, Wilkins Laflamme is the first to examine who exactly is practicing it and to what end. Digital religion practices are much more prevalent in the generally more religious U.S. when compared to a more Canadian context, according to the report. Wilkins Laflamme said digital religion practices are often but not always tied to other in-person religious and spiritual activities among millennials. So what her report is talking about is how the new way of interacting with church, whether that be listening to a podcast, watching the sermon on YouTube, those digital aspects of church, are those a new way to reach out to people or to engage a population that is disengaged with the church completely? And the finding is that while those bring in some new people, the vast majority of people using those resources are already Christians involved with some sort of church. Going through the article, a lot of it indicates that most of the digital resources are used by people who already attend like that specific church. So your church produces a sermon podcast series that you listen to. And so you may not go to church every weekend, but you listen to the podcast every week, that sort of thing. Or it's somebody that is interested in one specific like preacher, and so they go out of their way to like listen to that podcast, that sort of thing. So a really interesting statistic, really interesting idea. Um, it's I think it's important for all spiritual um, organizations to understand what the content and what the media that they're producing is doing, right? It's important for us too. Like, we want to know who's engaging with it, we want to know why they're engaging with it, and we want to know what their response is. Because in this new era of digital feedback, you know, if if I put something out there, somebody may watch it and never say anything. Somebody may watch it and say the most vile thing or the most tacit thing, like, great. Those ideas don't help the situation, right? I can see how many views I have, but if people aren't saying anything, then what do I do with that? What do I do with that information? So it's important for any business, any spiritual, organization, any group that's looking to like affect change, like activist groups, to know that kind of information, right? So there's no begrudging there. I understand that. Like, if a church wants to understand what is happening with their digital content, that should be really important to them because they're trying to produce something that spreads their message. Just like any of us, just like I am, just like whoever, right? One of the things that I find really interesting though is that how data is used by the church is startlingly similar to how data is used by corporate business, right? There is a site, sorry, getting to the top of it, that's called Reach Right. They do a lot of stuff with statistics and church and just kind of the way those things interact. They talk a lot about a lot of things that I personally don't agree with, but they do keep a lot of good information. Okay. So I'm looking at an article that has a lot of their statistics in it. They're talking about attendance versus engagement. Uh, After COVID, attendance went down, but personal engagement with like activities, like service activities in particular, went up, which is really cool to think about. Like, that it's become less important to, attend a weekly service, but more important to go out of your way to do something with the community, right? And in conjunction with your church, like, that should be stated clearly, that like this is churches looking at themselves. This is not churches looking at how the outside world interacts with them. It is like churches looking at their own congregations. There's been a rise in part-time vocational ministry, so people that don't work full-time for the church. Only 2/3 of churches in the United States have a full-time pastor. They talk about uh, how a growing number of ministries are engaging in outreach to their communities. And I have nothing but praise for that. If you go to a church that does something awesome in your community, we would love to hear about it, because so much of media is this intensely polarizing, we're left, we're right, and like we're definitely confronting a lot of ideas and how the church sees the world, but I feel like most of the time our confrontation is directed squarely at leadership. Like, it it is difficult to separate those two in a digital medium, to say like, when we talk about this, we're more focused on leadership than we are on, the average church goer. But know that we're trying to punch up, not down. Like, when I personally criticize somebody like a Joel Olstein or Prosperity Gospel, I'm not saying everyone who follows him is a sinner and evil and horrible. I'm saying that dude went out of his way to like distort very clear biblical teachings and make himself into a personality cult, right? And for me, that has a lot less to do with faith than it has to do with the danger of creating those kind of situations where you have this massive group of people following one guy, and on the flip of a switch, he could say something absurd and insane, and those people will follow because they believe it's mandated by God, even though there's nothing biblical about what's going on. This is the part that gets a little weirder to me. So, churches rely on tax exemption and donations, right? As a consequence, I feel the modern church has become obsessed with donation data. The next few parts of this talk about how credit card gifting is more popular. They talk about how December continues to be the most popular gifting month of all. They talk about how women donate more frequently than men. They talk about how Gen Z and millennial attendance is down. And they talk about how they can use digital outreach to bring those people back in. Okay? And all of those things kind of put together as indicate we need more donations, so we need to figure out how to get a younger generation to come back for donations. None of this is couched in spiritual language. None of it is put into the context of, that we would have heard in, the 90s evangelical world of saving souls, saving lives. All of it is just statistic based, get butts in seats or get butts in front of cameras or monitors so that people can donate. That's a dangerous place to be in. I feel that once a church has expanded itself to the point where it's more concerned about its budget than its outreach, it's no longer a church. It's a business. And that is the kind of thing that I feel we should all balk against, no matter what our religious persuasion is. It's hard to go further on that without, really just leaning on personal opinion. I need to do more research and figure out more about how spirituality in other places can be supported without having to rely on a corporate business model. Look forward to that, I guess. I'm going to start reading about it, but if you have any thoughts on that, do you have thoughts on why it's important for churches to be wealthy? Not just financially stable, that I understand, but like a need for ever expanding growth. We understand that in a capitalist system, there is this notion that there is an ever expanding amount of wealth that a corporation can sink its teeth into, and it can always grow profit. Can spirituality always grow like that? Or is there a point where personal opinion, like there are going to be people that never convert on all sides of it? Islam, Buddhism, atheism, Christianity, like if one thing became the only religion, there will always be people that don't convert to it. Is it more important to grow or to serve? I think that's the question I'm asking. What do you think? Is it more important to grow or to serve? Yeah. Let's move on to the last one. Super uplifting, right? Great, good times. Let's talk about the increase in political violence in the United States. Story that happened Sunday. that I didn't really see much about, which is interesting, and I think it's because there's not really a lot of information about it other than what happened and the guy who did its name. But this is from Associated Press. A man drove his car into a barricade near the United States Capitol early Sunday and then began firing gunshots in the air before fatally shooting himself, according to police, who said he did not seem to be targeting any members of Congress. I mean, he did drive into the Capitol building, so he was targeting Congress. Was he targeting someone specific? No, he hit a fence. Sorry. The incident happened just before 4 a.m. At a vehicle barricade at East Capitol Street Northeast and 2nd Street Southeast in Washington. It comes at a time when law enforcement authorities across the country are facing an increased number of threats, and federal officials have warned about the potential of violent attacks on government buildings in the days since the FBI search of former President Donald Trump's Mar-a-Lago estate in Florida. The attack is reminiscent of an incident when a man drove a vehicle into two Capitol police officers at a checkpoint in April 2021, killing an 18-year veteran of the force, and many on Capitol Hill remain on edge after supporters of then-President stormed the Capitol on January 6th. We're all familiar with that nuttiness. We've all seen the footage. If you're watching this, I assume that you have done that. So, one thing that I find is really interesting is that I don't know that. Oh, let's keep going. Sorry. So first, let's talk about the PNAS, okay? Because we're going to be talking about some things that they've put in a study. The PNAS is one of the world's most cited and comprehensive multidisciplinary scientific journals, publishing more than 3,500 research papers annually. The Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences is a peer-reviewed journal of the National Academy of Sciences. It is an authoritative source of high-impact, original research that broadly spans the biological, physical, and social sciences. The journal is global in scope, and submission is open to all researchers worldwide. So, just want to give some bona fides to the article from PNAS that I am going to be talking about. So, first quote. Recent political events show that members of extreme political groups support partisan violence, and survey evidence supposedly shows widespread public support. We show, however, that after accounting for survey-based measurement error, support for partisan violence is far more limited. Prior estimates overstate support for political violence because of random responding by disengaged respondents. And because of a reliance on hypothetical questions about violence in general instead of questions on specific acts of political violence. These same issues also cause the magnitude of the relationship between previously identified correlates and partisan violence to be overstated. So what this article is about is the overstatement of people's support of political violence here in the United States. We've all seen it, X amount of people support civil war. The right is more violent than the left is more violent than the right. Oh, they burned down buildings in Seattle. Oh, there's guys literally shooting up an FBI agent after Mar-a-Lago. On and on and on. Okay? So we all have heard this. We've all heard that there's this increased support of political violence. Okay? And we are seeing a rise in political violence. Listening to the Senate Judiciary Committee, there's a task force that investigates threats made to, election officials, and the amount of threats has literally gone up 1,000%. That's crazy. People calling and saying reprehensible things to people about them, their families, their children's, and before anybody steps in to say, well, that's just freedom of speech, those kind of threats are in fact political violence. If you don't think a violent threat is political violence, especially when levied against any politician, any person, that is in that kind of elected office, then you're wrong. For the same reason that you would be wrong if you called your significant other and threatened to kill them. It's harassment. Like, it's illegal. Like, you can't talk to people that way and then claim free speech, because a threat is just that. It's a threat. Like, we talk about these things as realities. When somebody threatens to kill someone else, that is wrong. Period. Whether you like that or not is besides the point. But speech can be political violence. Okay. The support of it, though, isn't as widespread as it seems. So let's get back into the article. Evidence suggests that effective polarization is not related to and does not cause increases in support for political violence, and is generally unrelated to political outcomes. Moreover, partisan violence appears to be unrelated to many other political variables. We are therefore left with a phenomenon that is not explained by the current literature on partisan animosity, that is rarely observed in the world, but that is based on prior work supported by a near majority of the American population. There are three things that they have found that point out this disconnect. So, polls are showing that people support political violence more than they used to. There's an increase in threats of violence and a verbalization of violence, and there has been an increase in actual political violence over the last few years. Okay? But they're still fairly rare. It seems to have ramped up some since last week. There was the attack on the FBI. There's now, there was an armed group in front of another FBI office. There's the guy that ran into the Capitol. Like, that was kind of boom, boom, boom right after this. And we'll see how it goes in the future. But when we're looking at polling as far as the past, there's three things that this PNAS article talks about getting wrong. So the first is ambiguous questions create an upward bias in estimates of support for violence. Even if respondents truthfully report their views on political violence, vague questions make it impossible to compare responses across individuals and render sample averages uninterpretable. So the first thing they're pointing at is really vague questions like, do you support political violence? Without defining what support means, without defining what political violence is. Does that just mean somebody yelling at someone over the phone, or does that mean someone assassinating someone? Without clarifying those ideas, like, sure, I support political violence. No, I don't support political violence, have almost no meaning because there's no definition to what that is, all right? The second one, disengaged respondents upwardly bias measurements of support for political violence. The goal of all surveys is to capture genuine opinions from a sample. However, it is well known that not all respondents engage in the thought, consideration, and reflection necessary to provide reasoned responses to all questions, and some may even over-report rare and negative traits to troll researchers. As the complexity of the work needed to answer a question increases, as in thinking about meaning, filling in details in ambiguous questions, forming an opinion on a question a respondent has never maybe considered, the motivation to deeply engage decreases. Respondents are more likely to statifice when, which is when they basically, you say more, most likely, like when you're filling out one of those 1 through 5 surveys and you just hit 4 down the line because you don't want to think about it. Respondents may simply select a neutral midpoint, same thing, just right down the middle. Randomly select a response, sure, B, or even just quit doing the survey. Okay, they suspect that the vague and ambiguous nature of current survey measures of political violence are especially likely to cause respondents to do this. Okay, so like, if your question isn't super specific or doesn't have an example, the more somebody has to think about it, the more likely are they to just click dink and not think about it and not give they'll either not give a real response, a well thought out response, or they'll just give the wrong response because they're sick of doing the survey. Okay. There's also an assessing of partisan differences in who commits political violence. Concern about political violence in the United States is often associated with increasing levels of effective polarization between Democrats and Republicans. But existing measures of support for political violence tend to not assess whether providing information about the partisanship of who committed the act of violence affects support or opposition for the act of violence. Providing this information is important because there are two potential interpretations of a positive effect. If the response is sincere, it could be that co-partisans give additional leeway for acts committed by co-partisans. But if the response is insincere, it could be that partisans in general are merely offering support for their party, which is a version of partisan cheerleading. While randomizing information about partisanship alone is insufficient to distinguish between these two possibilities, failure to find a difference is in a well-powered study provides strong evidence that leeway nor cheering occur. So what it's saying is, if we don't delineate, especially when we're trying to get to the root of like partisan violence in the United States, if we don't delineate, do you support political violence by the left wing? Do you support political violence by the right wing? And then asking the respondent, do you consider yourself left wing or do you consider yourself right wing? There's no way to like really correlate the thought process. Okay. So if we don't know if somebody is left leaning or right leaning, and then we ask them, do you support left wing violence? If a right leaning person says no, makes sense, right? Because they disagree with the other team. Left leaning says yes. Is it because they're giving, we work together? Or is it because, our party's doing something? Without this information, it makes it really difficult to assess. One of the other things that they talk very specifically about is that neutral position. In surveys that don't have that neutral position and have ambiguous questions, you're forced to pick on support or not support side. And that can skew it. And most people are going to skew on a support side because in a lot of people's minds, there is some room for violence in a political sense because we have perpetuated that. The United States is a very warlike nation that has used violence to push its political agenda. Not in a right or left sense, but in a historically American sense, to say, this part of this continent belongs to us. We take it, whether you like it or not, and anybody that's on this land is getting off. That's political violence that's been supported and that we live amongst all the time, right? So most people in many ways tacitly support political violence, and if there isn't that neutral position for somebody to say, I don't lean either way, and they're forced to confront that decision, and they're forced to confront it with a really obscure or like a not well reasoned question, there's a good chance they're just going to click support or mildly support, because it doesn't make them feel like they're horrible, but it also gives them the room to say, there's some instances where this might work. So all of those things are skewing statistics towards political violence, right? If we really step back and we see that, there's all these errors in that, and the media is reporting on this increase in political violence, and that is true, then what can we look at in history to show us what direction that takes? So I'm going to read a little bit of a transcript from a PBS NewsHour article. Again, links will be in the show notes. Between Omar Wasow, who is a researcher, and Hari Srivasan, who is the reporting. And I will call them Omar and Hari, so I don't stumble over last names. So Omar says, I looked at both nonviolent and violent protests in the 1960s, and to be clear, this is looking at thousands of protests over a dozen years. So it's not just like the main ones, the big ones that we've all heard about. And what I found was that protests are enormously powerful at generating press, and in addition, what the news covers predicts what changes in public opinion will occur. So when there was a massive wave in the early part of the 60s of non-violent protests that drove headlines about civil rights. In a later period in the 60s, as we start to see more violent protests, we see more coverage of riots and public opinion shifts, and the most important problems, people say, is the issue of crime and riots. Hari said, so is it about the framing or is it about the actual actions? Meaning, if it's nonviolent protests that influence opinion in one direction, do violent protests have maybe the opposite effect? To which Omar responded, so framing matters enormously here. I think both protest tactics and media coverage matters a lot, so they're both important actors. And protesters obviously have the ability to make choices about the kinds of tactics they employ, what kinds of strategies in terms of rhetoric, what kind of things are done. For example, in the 1960s, we see really remarkable intention to create very dramatic images that would help to, in the language of the 60s, shock the conscience of the nation. The framing that the media does is really central here. So whether we're sort of looking through the eyes of the protesters or really through the eyes of the police matters a lot. And that kind of justice frame, or a police-centric frame, does a lot to shift public opinion. And in the latter part of the 60s, that we saw more violent protests arise, the frame really does shift from justice to this kind of focus on disorder and riots, and that shift in the media frame has a significant influence on public opinion. When we're looking at protest movements, activism, all of those things, it has always been more effective to use nonviolent protest to push your agenda forward, for the very reason that when the media covers it, they don't have some state view that they can defer to. Because while we would all, love to believe that the media is highly liberalized or highly, conservatized, which there are definitely stations that are both of those things. In general, the default of media is to defer to authority, right? So, sure, Donald Trump was doing crazy stuff, but he still had the bully pulpit. Sure, Joe Biden does incompetent stuff, but he still has the bully pulpit. When the president says something, everybody listens. And in general, people, whether they agree with it or disagree with it, are forced to defer to that because in many cases we don't have a choice, right? Because the system and the structures around us are going to defer to that because he's the leader, no matter how bad the leader is, right? And we have, yes, the last two, not gems, but let's talk about that we've had a string of not great leaders for quite some time, okay? Because the media in general defaults to a centralized position, all right, and specifically the centralized position of authority, they are going to defer to seeing it through the police's eyes versus the protesters' eyes. So in a nonviolent protest, there's no opportunity for the authority to be seen in a positive light. Because if authority attacks nonviolent people just sitting on the ground, then it is very difficult to justify that, right? If somebody threw a brick through a window and started burning a building down or cracked off a gunshot at an FBI agency, people are going to defer to authority and say, crap, these people are here to help us. They're the ones that stopped the guy that threw the brick. They're the guys that stopped the shooter. They're the guys that did this, right? They're the guys that fixed this. You see it constantly in how much more airtime a police debriefing press conference is going to get than a press conference from the people that were attacked by the police in a protest are going to get, right? Like, when we're watching the news, do we see communiques from, people that have taken over things? Even, let's look on the conservative side. Even Eamon Bundy. Eamon Bundy takes over the wildlife refuge. Okay. Whose voice are we hearing? Are we hearing Eamon Bundy's, who has perpetuated this, violence against property, violent rhetoric? He has literally armed himself and invaded a space. Are we hearing his voice, or are we hearing the police press conference? Right? Charlottesville, the guy that rammed in all the people, awful, truly, truly horrible. Do we hear the voice of those who support him, or the police press conference? Okay, so we can talk about Black Lives Matter protests. Are you hearing the police debrief, or are you hearing the voice of the actual protesters? Right? Media will defer to authority. And as soon as you give any excuse for the media to portray authority in a positive light, they will do it. Because having that authority system in place protects their interests. It protects their financial interests. It protects the interests of the safety of reporters. Because when there's not crime on the street, reporters are way less likely to get killed. And if they're not having to encounter police that are attacking innocent people, if they can say, no, look, we did this because we had to, the media is going to defer to them. So when we think about that, political violence isn't as popular probably as you think it is, because of the way the media reports it. The media is also going to defer to authority in almost every situation, like across most medias. What is your end goal in participating in political violence? No matter what spectrum you're on, like right, left, middle, whatever. Is your end goal to elicit change? And if it is, why choose violence? When violence is typically shown to affect the opposite effect, right? If they can point to violence, they will point to a reason to need to crack down, right? Police are highly militarized. Police are extremely able to shut down whatever gets put in their way. Okay? I guess just food for thought. Is your tactic the most effective tactic? Both sides of the groups. When you stand in front of an FBI agency with M16s, AR-15s, whatever, do you think you're helping your cause? When you're burning down a Starbucks, do you think you're helping your cause? It's definitely something important to look at, especially for any activist on any side. So, well, that about does it, I'm thinking, for the show. We've talked about 3 awesome subjects. Again, we would love to hear what you have to say. We would love your opinions, your thoughts, any suggestions when it comes to production, any suggestions when it comes to topics to talk about. Let us know in the comments or on our social media. Obviously, you'll be able to watch this even when it's not live, so hit subscribe, hit the bell on the notifications so that you don't miss a beat. Thank you very much. Again, I've been Gabe. This is Digging Deeper, brought to you by Spitefilled Clothing Cooperative. You have a spiteful day, and think at all costs.
I don't wanna be loved by you, be loved by you. I don't need to be hurt or rescued, not by you.